Okay, good. What I'd like to do today is give a few pictures or windows into stories about translation as it occurred when people were crossing cultural boundaries, primarily in the effort of mission. Although, as we'll see, the interface between mission and politics is always there. But mostly today, I'm going to be doing sort of a historical. This is not even an overview. This is me just dipping down in some places. And then next week, I'm going to bring some input on what are the specific issues that translators face. And any of you who have read in translation and have thoughts about that should feel free to bring your experiences. I'm going to give some examples from not only biblical translation, but other translations. I think all of us probably encounter translations in something that we're interested in and recognize right away the complexity of reading something in another language than the language in which it was first expressed. So today it's more lecture, and next week hopefully we can have some discussion. But I want to talk about translation and mission, and so just so that you can get a feel for how quickly translation of the Bible was going on, I have the dates of the earliest versions, and that's the word that we use technically for translation, a version. It's to try to help people distinguish between an edition, which is either the Greek or the Hebrew text in whatever edited form it has appeared, whether it's the Masoretic text or something else. So those are editions of the original languages, and versions are translations. And of course, versions are based on editions, and that's a whole game of its own, which I won't get into unless, yeah, Susan?
So but the originals would be in Greek?
The original biblical manuscripts are in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek.
Thank you.
Only those languages. So anything else would be considered a version. Armenian in the 3rd century. Some people call this the best version ever. It does seem to contain, it seems to represent some of the best manuscripts that we have of the Greek and the Hebrew. And so it's one that is often consulted when people are trying to, if there's a phrase that is confusing, they can consult the Armenian to see how it's done. Old Latin was also done in the 3rd century, commonly known in the scholarly world as Vetus Latina. And interestingly, the Latin that we studied in high school, classical Latin, which is the language of Ovid and people like that, is not deemed to be the same. The Bible translations into Latin were primarily done in North Africa. And in fact, there's some claim that it is in North Africa that the Latin language was kept alive because in the Roman world, the Roman elite wanted to use Greek because Greek was the sophisticated language. So the emperors were hiring or taking Greek slaves to train their sons in Greek, and that was sort of the language of the elite. That is represented all the way up into Shakespeare when in his Julius Caesar he has, I think it's Brutus says to Cassius, it's all Greek to me, which is a way of saying you think you're somebody. So that's how Latin was being used in the early stages of the Roman Empire. Syriac in the 3rd century. Syriac is a very close cognate to Aramaic, and it's actually written in a different script, but represents almost the identical manuscripts as Aramaic manuscripts. And so there's older versions, and then in the 5th century, a version called the Peshitta, which is the basis of the translations that, as we can briefly mention, made their way to India in the 5th century, with the movement of Christians into South India, a tradition that's been there for 1,500, 1,600 years. Coptic is the language of the ancient Egyptians. It's what is represented, if you remember the Rosetta Stone, it is the new alphabet that was developed for Demotic Egyptian. And the Coptic alphabet is mostly a Greek alphabet, but with letters added to it to represent sounds that Greek doesn't have. When I had an opportunity to spend some time in Egypt, visited lots of Coptic churches, I found it quite easy to read the liturgical symbols because all the theological words were in Greek. I can't read Coptic, but Coptic was very, very early in translation. Georgian, this is the part of the world we know as Georgia today. It's not entirely clear when this was done. They think it was very early. Georgia and Armenia are close geographically. And so the manuscript tradition we have is from the 9th century, but it's assumed to be much earlier. And then Ethiopic, the language which is still in use in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, usually referred to now as Ge'ez, but the question of when those translations were first done kind of depends on how you interpret the story of the first Christians who went to Ethiopia. Yeah. Chava.
Could you clarify whether all of these versions included both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament?
That's a good question, and my sources think primarily about New Testament. That's where the manuscript tradition is being traced. But it's pretty clear that the Armenian included the whole Bible. The Syriac did. The Ethiopic did. And in fact, in the Ethiopic tradition, there are some of these pseudepigraphal writings that have continued to be part of the Ethiopic Bible, even though they're not part of the Western canon. So the Coptic did. I wouldn't be able, I'm not a manuscript expert enough to tell you which each manuscript would contain, but the translations were being done across the spectrum of Scripture. I think the real interesting question in terms of the Hebrew Bible is whether they were translating from the Septuagint or not. And I think in most of these cases, they were translating from the Septuagint, not from the Hebrew. But probably the Syriac would have been translated from the Hebrew. And that's about as far as my knowledge goes on that one, but it's a very, very interesting question. Yeah, Tama?
Is one of those that I'm not recognizing the basis for Russian?
Not yet.
Okay.
We're getting to that, but not until the 9th century.
Okay.
She asked about Russian, and I'm going to talk, that's actually one of the stories I want to tell. It's very interesting to me that there was no translation made in Arabic, because there were both Jews and Christians in the Arabian Peninsula from the 1st century on. And why that didn't happen there is an unresolved question. Some people suggest that that was one of the reasons why the Quran was so quickly powerful in the Arabian context. But again, that's theorizing. And notice no Western languages. That's probably because apart from Latin, the Western European Mediterranean didn't have written script, whereas these Eastern cultures, Eastern in the ancient sense, Eastern, Western, whatever that means geographically, did have scripts. So they had they had ability to write. And we'll see as we go on that one of the issues, this will get to the Russian question, is you have to have something to write in before you can write. And that was certainly an issue for Old Slavonic. Okay, so that's kind of, we can see that the Jewish pattern of translating continued apace in the Christian communities as people were moving about. And whether those movements, as you may know, the Christian historical tradition is that each of these places was touched by an apostle. And they all have their history about which apostle came to them. In terms of historicity, we can't really back up any of those claims except possibly Mark in Egypt. there does seem to be some pretty close connection there. But so some of that movement may have been specifically church or mission oriented. A lot of it was probably commercial, and we'll see that the travel of merchants and the travel of monks often go together.
Nancy,
Yeah,
on the,
Larry, Mike.
since we have an Armenian church just across the street,
Mhm.
is the 3rd century still used there at all?
Okay, that's a really good question, and I have not been over there. I will say that in all of these churches, they have continued to hold on to the tradition of the ancient languages. It doesn't mean that anybody understands them. I know in the Coptic, in Egypt, I attended a number of masses in the Coptic church, and there was a lot of Coptic going on, but all of the basic stuff was in Arabic. So people don't speak Coptic, and they probably don't understand it. It has the same valence as Latin does in the Roman Catholic Church. So I'm pretty sure, without even going there, that there's some old Armenian that's part of that church. Those holy languages, Ge'ez in Ethiopic, again, in Ethiopia, if you go to a church there, they're going to have the scriptures in Ge'ez. People don't speak it. They don't really understand it. So it's this very similar situation for all of these ancient holy languages. Okay, anything else? Yes, Dallas? Put the mic right up.
I was thinking about the service that we have during Easter, the crucifixion of Christ.
Mhm.
And there's a line in part of the Mass that really is Aramaic. Where
Yes.
it starts with Eli, Eli,
Mhm.
lama sabachthani.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't know what it was, of course.
Mhm.
So we had to ask the minister,
Mm-hmm.
what was it? Yeah.
Right, and that it's actually an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew, Psalm 22. So it's the first line of Psalm 22, and in at least one of the Gospels, I know in Mark, it actually says which being translated means. So Mark in the Greek translated that from Aramaic into Greek, but if you hear it read in a liturgical service, someone may not translate that for you. Yeah. So that's even within the biblical texts themselves, you see that kind of translation going on. Yeah. John? Mike back there?
This is an old recollection on my part, but I remember Hanana Shrawi, who was on the PLO Council, who spoke very fluent English, once rebuking some European Christians who were chastising her, and she said, "My ancestors were Christian in the 3rd century when yours were still living in caves." And so I wonder what language the Palestinian Christians
Today.
It was Aramaic? Or
Well,
other-
Palestinian Christians probably entered into Arabic, I would imagine. There would have been some Aramaic, but I don't think that thread is quite as strong as you might find it in some other places. Again, that question of language transmission is really complicated. But it's certainly true that Christians throughout the Middle East very proudly claim a very ancient tradition. Egyptian Christians will tell you, you know what, we're the real Egyptians. That's very clear from their perspective. Yeah. So it would be a similar kind of memory. Yeah. Okay. Anything else on this one? Okay. So let's talk about Latin a little bit. The word Vulgate, which is the Bible of Western Europe for at least 1,000 years, comes from the term versio vulgata, the popular version. When Jerome, the monk, was asked by Pope Damasus to translate, the idea was, we're going to do two things. We're going to update the Latin to make it what ordinary people can understand, and we are going to correct all the crazy manuscript messes that have already developed. So the use of the term was referring it was referring to the Septuagint and to the Latin translation. So they actually called the Septuagint the Vulgate, because it was in a popular Greek of that time. So Jerome was asked, this was middle 4th century. He tells us in a letter to the Pope that the Pope asked him to make a new Latin translation. We don't have the letter that the Pope wrote to him, and some people think that he kind of played up how much the Pope wanted this, but that's speculation. In any case, he wrote back then to say, essentially, I'm not sure if this is a good idea because I'm going to get in trouble for doing it. I'm paraphrasing. Is there indeed any learned or unlearned man who, when he picks up the volume in his hand and takes a single taste of it and sees what he will have read to differ, i.e. in the other manuscripts, might not instantly raise his voice, calling me a forger, proclaiming me now to be a sacrilegious man, that I might dare to add, to change, or to correct anything in the old books. And this is where we see the Christian problem emerging, which had already begun to be quite resolved in the Jewish context, where the manuscripts were being much more carefully monitored. Nobody knew about the Dead Sea Scrolls, so put those aside. So the scribal tradition of the rabbis was much more disciplined. And in the Christian context, people were copying off bits and pieces. There's some idea that people were taking, say, 2 or 3 letters of Paul, putting them in their hip pocket in unlettered parts of Europe, and becomes the Bible that is used there for 1,000 years. I thought it'd be interesting just to show you, now this is a little bit weird because I'm doing English translations from the Latin and from the Greek. But here's an example of how the Latin by Jerome and whoever edited it further takes a little bit of liberty with what the Greek does. So this is in John when Jesus is talking to the woman of Samaria. And the English from Latin, the Samaritan woman said to him, "How dost thou, being a Jew, ask of me to drink, who am a Samaritan woman?" Done. But the Greek, so this would be in the early Greek manuscripts, the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" And then adds the explanation, Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. So the original manuscript is really emphasizing the tension there. But in the Latin context, remember that the Latin context is more Western. They probably don't care about the distinctions between Jews and Samaritans, so that gets left out. Which is just to say the translations are always making those kinds of decisions too. What do you keep? What do you change? What do you leave out? And I don't mean to say that people were, there are some theorists, probably some of you have heard of Bart Ehrman. Yeah, he is probably the #1 textual scholar in maybe the world, in the United States. And he's a really very fine scholar, but he's developed a very cynical view about manuscripts and assumes that all of them have been tinkered with enormously. I don't agree with that. He's very interesting to read, though, as he tries to trace that possibility. Okay, now we're going to jump to another part of the world. We have an interesting record of Persian missionaries, so from Baghdad, who went to China. And probably the first travel there was even prior to any Christian movement, because the Silk Road was an active travel route going back into the BCE time. And the reason why we know about this is because a very large monument was discovered in the 16th century, but it's clearly dated to 781 CE. And in that monument, which is written in Chinese, except for a few some Syriac script at the bottom. It basically tells this whole story. And it begins with the story of a monk named Alopen, and he was sent from Baghdad, from the patriarch in Baghdad. But by this time, Islam is already present, but things are still fairly calm for the Eastern Christians in Baghdad. They're no longer associated with Rome, so you've got that whole thing where I'm not doing church history here, but that's a complicated thing as well. And because there were Persians in China doing business, he was sent probably to serve those communities. 7th century. So we have, this is the head section of the Xi'an monument. It's the actual monument would probably be from about here to the, has anybody seen it or like a replica of it? Okay, I thought about putting in the whole thing, but you can't really see anything. It's a very large stone, a flat stone with thousands of Chinese characters on it. I had a Chinese student once, and I asked her if she could read it, and she said no. I can tell you what each of the characters are, but I can't read it. So that again shows us that we're dealing with the changes in language. This is the headstone, which is up at the top, and the Chinese says, Stella to the propagation in China of the luminous religion of the Roman Empire. So that's the way this monument is using Chinese to describe what's going on. If you look really carefully, do I have a pointer here? Just up at the top, you can actually see a cross, right? And lotus flowers. This is called a lotus cross, and it's very prominent in representations of Chinese Christianity from very, very ancient times. So that's what,
I'm sorry.
that's okay, you just went one slide ahead. It doesn't matter, I think we're okay.
No, I want to get the pointer for you. It's there. Yep. Oh, but
Yeah.
it doesn't.
It's okay. It's not critical, it's not critical. Let me go back here just for a minute. If you just look up at the top, you can see the lotus cross. It's a bit fine, but that's what you have there. So we see right away that here's an effort to communicate in some kind of Chinese way something about what is being represented here. And the name that is given to the Christian community is the luminous religion. Now, it's really significant to note that this was during the late Tang Dynasty, and it was a time when the emperor was a little tolerant and was also trying to keep the Buddhists under control. And so in order to do that, he was willing to allow some space. And so he actually welcomed Alopen. Alopen was given a title, was given a library, a place to work, and actually had the ear of the emperor for some time. And this is somewhat recounted in the stela. What happened was that the emperor took a concubine who was radically anti-Western. And over time then, the Christian community there was quite suppressed to the point of disappearance. And when Jesuit missionaries showed up in the 16th century, they had no idea that there had been Eastern Christians in China at this time. I want to show you just a little section of some of the text from the monument. This is I made this chart, so I'm going to just show you what I have here. I have two different translations of the monument, one by a Japanese scholar and one by a European, I think he was English scholar. So, and then I made some notes. This will show you how complex it is to make any kind of translation. So in both texts, it refers to, and this would be the Old Testament, the 24 sages or the 24 holy ones. Now you may say, you told me it was 22, which I did, if you remember, because the way books get counted up is usually 22. However, there were some people that counted that same list as 24. It had something to do with dividing Judges and Ruth. I've been trying to track this down to get a definite answer about why it was 24, and there's a number of theories. But in any case, you see that they are referring in the monument to the Hebrew Scriptures by the way they were understood in both Jewish and Christian traditions. And then they talk about Jesus. And they, in the Japanese translation of the Chinese, he established his new teaching of non-assertion, which operates silently through the Holy Spirit. And Palmer says, heaven has decreed that the new religion of the three-in-one purity that cannot be spoken of should be proclaimed. Those are the same lines. So kind of complicated, right? We do see the presence of some kind of maybe vaguely Trinitarian thinking here. And of course, I think about the fact that Saiki is Japanese, so he's already the third language and probably has a stronger sense of the Buddhist relationship there. Both of them refer to something 8 cardinal virtues or 8 territories. And that is, the number 8 is a Buddhist formula, but some people count up the Beatitudes as 8. The sayings of Jesus, blessed are the poor, and so forth. We have 3 constant gates, or the gate of 3 constants. That's a little closer. People are guessing maybe faith, hope, and love. Not clear on that. And then in this last statement, it is a description of the death of Jesus. Hanging up the bright sun, he swept away the abodes of darkness. Or the religion of light, and remember that's what you see at the top. Teachings are like the resplendent sun. They have the power to dissolve the dark realm and destroy evil forever. So, I have a book about religion in China, Christian religion in China, and it just points out that the translation of this monument is incredibly complex, but it is clearly trying to articulate in some form that would be recognizable for Chinese speakers something about the Christian tradition. There are some other texts that were developed during this time called the Jesus Messiah Sutras, and we do have some of those texts, again, written in Chinese. And when they wanted to speak about God, they used the term celestial venerable, which sounds quite Confucian. Cool wind for the Holy Spirit, and of course, going all the way back to the Hebrew, we know that wind and spirit, Hebrew and Greek, are the same word. But interestingly, in the Jesus Messiah Sutras, they transliterated the words for Jesus. So, Mashiach, which is Messiah, the Anointed One, and Yeshu, which is a transliteration of Jesus. So, as far as we know, there were no Bible translations per se made during this period, but there were some liturgical materials, some things that were sort of theological commentary that were done in Chinese, and an effort was made to convey some things out of the scriptures. If you read the whole Xi'an monument, there are parts of it which really do sound like they're just trying to tell the whole Bible story very, very succinctly. And you can pick that up in any of the translations. So a very far distant movement which shows an effort to relate the stories of the biblical text without doing a Bible translation as such. There's a new book out about the translation of the Bible in China that I haven't gotten my hands on yet, and I would like to do that, but I haven't found it. Okay, now we're going to get to the Russians. Tama, this is for you. Okay, mission to the Slavs. Here's where we see some of the political wrangling that was going on in Europe and how that affected this kind of Bible translation. So by the 9th century, the tensions between Constantinople and Rome, Ravenna, the Western Church were pretty standard, pretty strong, And both of them were jockeying for a presence in Central and Eastern Europe. The Romans had pretty much established a place. France, Spain, of course, had been solidly in the Roman world for quite some time. And Constantinople had had most of its contact eastward with the Armenians and the Georgians and so forth. But the emperor in Constantinople sent two brothers, Constantine and Methodius, as missionaries to the Slavs. This was clearly a mission effort, as well as that we want to bring these people into the realm of our church. Now, Constantine was also named Cyril, which is where we get Cyrillic. So, but the actual language that he developed, the alphabet, it's not quite modern Cyrillic. It's called Glagolithic. And in the same way as they did in Coptic, he used Greek letters. So, and even today in some of the Cyrillic, there are some representations that are like Greek letters. But of course, there are a lot of sounds that cannot be represented by the Greek alphabet. And so the letters were developed for the Slavic. This would have, the Glagolithic alphabet is then represented in what we call Old Church Slavonic, which is the holy language of the Russian and other Eastern churches of Slavic background. This is a story, though, about the tension that emerged because Moravia, where Cyril and Methodius were teaching and preaching, developing an alphabet, developing a liturgy, starting to translate scripture, there were Germanic princes that were in there sort of jockeying for political position, and their priests were affiliated with Rome, and so they were opposing the use of the Slavonic. So the tensions got high enough that Cyril and Methodius said, we're going to go to Rome. We're going to go straight to the top. It's interesting that in this instance, even though they were assigned by the patriarch in Constantinople, they knew they had to get the approval of Rome. And interestingly, they did. Now, that's its own very long and complicated story. The pope that had been pope when they headed out to Rome died by the time they got there. And so they were working with a new pope, but he actually approved of their work. He did tell them, he gave them a letter saying, you can use Slavonic in the Mass, but the epistle and the gospel lessons have to be read in Latin first. So you can see that in the 9th century, the use of Latin in the Roman Church was already being very firmly fixed. Cyril died in Rome, and his burial place there is a very important pilgrimage site. I was able to visit it, and they have everything around the burial site written both in Russian letters, Cyrillic letters, and in Latin alphabet, and in lots of different languages, and many people come there to pray. Methodius returned to Moravia, and he continued the work. He got arrested a couple times and thrown into prison, and then he got out again. He kept working on it. No permanent church was established in Moravia at this point, of an Eastern church, but the Slavonic liturgy had pretty well gotten fixed by the end of the 9th century, and it moved eastward into Bulgaria and eventually into Russia. Now, the origins of the Russian church are actually in Ukraine. And I can go into the current geography of that if you want, but the fact of the matter is that old Russia is Ukraine. And so the monks and the liturgy and the scripture in Russian are Ukrainian, geographically. Moscow comes along much later, but that's a whole other story. Okay, quick check-in, questions? I can see I'm a Kava.
Let me just mention that the alphabet eventually, and I don't know when this came in, but probably early, also used is at least one case of a Hebrew letter being used to represent the sound that wasn't.
Interesting. I don't know Cyrillic at all, so that,
Yeah.
but here, I'll give you a cartoon to go along with this. This is a modern cartoon from Bulgaria, but it's basically someone who's trying to work at literacy, and he has the two brothers, Cyril and Methodius, and they're basically telling people, learn the alphabet. So it's I think this was 1930.
Yeah, so if you look at the next to the last line, all the way to the left, all the way, so that is a sh.
That's the sin in the shin.
No,
Yeah.
exactly. In Slavonic, it's sh and ch, which are not. Sh is not a Hebrew sound, but they obviously use the letter shin to represent.
Right, which you don't have that sound in Greek. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'm glad I kept that cartoon. All right. I'm going to need to keep going here. Okay. Another episode. Now we're going to India. As I had said earlier, the Christians in South India were using the Syriac Bible probably from the 5th and 6th centuries. The story about how they got there is not entirely clear, but there's clearly an ancient established Christian community in South India. And, excuse me, sorry. Can somebody give me some water? Sorry. I got a drink. Active in India in the 18th century. But it was the emergence of sort of modern missionary thinking that raised the question of translating scripture into any of the Indian languages. And this was done, first of all, by William Carey. William Carey was an English Baptist. He was a shoemaker by profession, but he was very interested in languages. He went to India. He was sent by a Baptist missionary society. And he really wanted to do something that would communicate in the Indian context. He worked very hard to learn Sanskrit. Maybe that would help now, thanks. The ancient language of India, he recognized its value, and he did work at a translation of parts of the Ramayana into English. As far as I know, the first time anybody had done that. Another thing that he did was he was clearly motivated by a missionary zeal, and he laid out his principles of mission. If you study missiology, which is something that I did once, he's sometimes called the father of modern mission in a Protestant sense. And one of his principles was the Bible needs to be available to people in their own languages. So he set about learning the languages of India. And he translated the complete Bible into Bengali. He was living in Kolkata in Bihar. And then he did 5 other Indian languages. So he worked very hard to get the scripts down. Notice that each of these languages has a different script. He learned the scripts, he did the translations. Unfortunately, he did not have the right training or orientation to make good use of his Indian colleagues. And so basically what he did was a very wooden word-for-word translation, which is almost unreadable. And I was able to visit Serampore College, which he also helped to found. It's still an active theological training school today. And they have a library devoted to the memory of William Carey, and they have pictures. They have the actual Bibles that were translated and printed that he did. They're all there on display. None of them were ever really used anywhere because they didn't communicate to the people that were that needed them. So the actual translations into usable languages of India, of which there are many, happened much later in the 19th century. But the other thing that you can see here is that from the beginning, Carey was also under the thumb of the colonial authorities. They were Anglicans, they didn't like Baptists, and they were not interested in having the Bible translated into Indian languages. So Carey is remembered very warmly among Indian Christians generally as a person who cared about Indian culture and its traditions, and he did translations, but they weren't used. And as far as I know, he never got to South India. So the question of whether he ever knew any of the Christians from the ancient tradition isn't clear. Okay, now I'm going to go to Africa. A lot of this work I'm taking from a fairly magisterial book by Lamin Sana. He's a Gambian American. He died just a couple years ago, taught at Yale for many years. He wrote a book where he tried to make the case that it is actually the translation work of missionaries that was really important in the movement for independence in Africa. And it's actually a really good source book for lots of translation, not just in Africa, but elsewhere. But he said essentially it was missionary translators who came to and learned the local languages and then made them available in writing. Languages of the various parts of colonized Africa were not in any written form, so their written form all is using the Latin alphabet, but getting dictionaries put together and figuring out the grammar and all of that stuff was really important for the purposes of people's, African peoples thinking about their own liberation. One of the stories that he tells, which is really quite phenomenal, is of a Nigerian scholar named Crowther. He had been enslaved as a young man. He was caught up by Portuguese traders. This was after England had abolished slave trading. He was freed by British naval forces who stopped the Portuguese boat. And then he was sent to England where he studied. He became an Anglican. He was converted to Christianity. He became a bishop in the Anglican Church, and then they sent him back to Nigeria. And Crowther was a phenomenal linguist. It's not entirely clear to me just what kind of, he clearly had the theological training that allowed him to be ordained as a bishop, but he prepared a dictionary, probably the first dictionary in Yoruba, which is one of the main languages of southern Nigeria. And he's described as someone who was going everywhere with a pen and paper in hand. Another thing they say about him is he talked to both Christians and Muslims. He was very interested to learn about that. And his friends described him as watching the mouth of the elders, which was a way of trying to learn what the expressions are and what their meaning is, and then beginning work on Bible translation. So Crowther would be probably one of the earliest African translators given with an English training background. I'm not certain. I don't think Yoruba was his mother tongue, and I'd have to go dig into that further, but he clearly was familiar with the linguistic context of West Africa. Okay. One of the things that has been a big part of missionary discussion in translation, not only in Africa, but many other places, is what do you do with the word for God? Now, this is really interesting because even the the Greek word theos for God is actually just a form of Zeus. So are we talking about who is the God we're talking about, and how do we keep out, this would be the missionary question, how do we keep out pagan corruption or pagan misunderstanding? Sana tells this story. Methodists in Southern Africa did not want to use the Zulu term for God. The Zulu term for God is Nkulu Nkulu. The U in front is sort of the article. Unkulu Nkulu. So they thought, we don't know exactly what all that word might mean. It might not mean what we want it to mean. So they tried to introduce U Jehovah. Well, anybody who knows anything about Jehovah knows that that's a complete mistransliteration of the Hebrew name for God. It didn't go anywhere, it didn't catch fire. You know, with any language, when you're trying to introduce a word, it might take, it might not take. That one didn't work. One Anglican bishop tried to go using the Latin, so he took the Deus and made Udio. Sana says, African informants swept away such artificial contrivances. In the end, the Zulu term for God was adopted. And even today, again, when I had an opportunity to visit in Southern Africa, it's really fascinating to hear people praising Nkulu Nkulu, as well as other names across the Southern African region. The different names for God have been adopted into the worship practices. Sana, sometimes people criticize Sana for being too optimistic about how Christian mission and all these things work. He's not entirely optimistic. He does say, he argues that if the mission wasn't vernacularly credible, then it deserved all the criticism it received. But he was pretty much a favorable voice. There are, and we'll talk a little bit about this next week, there are certainly examples of really bad translation practice that happened. This question about the word for God has continued to persist into the 20th century. And I had an opportunity to listen to one of the translation consultants for United Bible Societies who described the conversation. He was in Panama. He was advising a group of local translators there. They were doing a translation into the Wanari language. And they had said, this is the Wanari name for God. I can't remember what it was. And the translators who were from Euro-American background said, we're not sure about that. We're not sure that is the God of the Bible. So he said, and he was very much in favor of using the local term. He said, we're going to send the local folks out for a month without us. They're going to go out and they're just going to talk to people. And when they come back, we'll see what they said. And so they sent out their consultants, the local consultants. They went out and visited in villages and talked to people, told Bible stories, did whatever they did, and then they came back and they said, it's the Wanari word. And so as the translation consultant, he said to his European colleagues, that's what we're using. So that happened in like the 1960s. Those kinds of things continue to happen. But I grew up in New Mexico listening to the Navajo Bible being read, and the word in the Navajo Bible was God. It's God Bezod, the word of God. So the issue continues in our time. I'm going to end with the woman I introduced to you the first week, and that is Faye Edgerton. She worked with others on the translation of the Navajo Bible. Some of the New Testament had already been done, but she worked to complete the whole Bible. And in her book, there are many illustrations of the difficulties. I'm going to do this one, and then I want to tell you one more story, and then I'll stop and see if you have questions. So in Navajo, in familiar relationships, there's not just one word for mother or father or aunt or uncle or sister. There's several words depending on your place. And one of the words that is complicated is the word for sister. There's older sister and there's younger sister. So she describes working with the translation team when they were dealing with the story of Jesus when he came to visit Mary and Martha. If you know that story, Jesus is there and Martha's in the kitchen hurriedly trying to make a meal, and Mary's sitting at the feet of Jesus listening to him. And Martha says, "Lord, why don't you make my sister help me?" The question is, which sister is which? And the Navajo people discussed it for a while, and they said, well, the bossy one is the older one. So Martha became the older sister, Shadi, and when she says, I want my sister, it's I want my younger sister to help me. There's another story that she tells, which is more complicated, and it's not just a word issue, but they were trying to come up with language for the altar on which the sacrifices were made. This would be in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures. And they were having a really hard time because the Navajo word that seemed to fit was the word that was also used for the counter in trading posts where traders negotiated with Navajos for their stuff. And that culture was very, very powerful. And the Navajos had just gone through a period. There had been a severe drought in the Southwest. And the government, the federal government or the state government, had decided that the lands were being overgrazed. And without much consultation, they had come in and they had just basically eliminated most of the Navajo flocks. And some of this negotiation had happened on the trading post counter. So she describes how hard it was to find a workaround to talk about the altar that didn't bring up all those bad images. And that's an example of not just a word question, but the whole political, social context in which translation is done. Okay, we could go on and on. Like I said, I picked some of my favorite stories. We have a few minutes, so if you have questions, we can talk about them. Maybe we can turn the lights on. Reflections, questions, anything?
Do you have any comments on
Mike?
Elmer Miller been here, one of our residents, those of you who've been here for a while, and his translations in Argentina?
Absolutely. Elmer was part of a group of people who went to the Argentine Chaco with the idea that rather than starting a church, they were just going to be there and see what happened. And if you read his book, that's what he talks about. But first of all, they were in the Argentine culture, the indigenous people of the Chaco are probably the lowest of the low. They are often, the language that's used for them by they would call them the criollos, the real Argentines, is almost animalistic. So the idea was to not only sit and learn from them, learn their languages, and Elmer was one of the first people to get Western, or to get Toba down well, that one of the main languages there, and then to increase their literacy so that they could deal with more authority and respect in the Argentine context. So I really have very high regard for the work that Elmer and his colleagues did there. I was able to visit there later after Elmer and Lois were gone. Lots of respect. Rick or Barbara?
Very brief. S.I. Hayakawa spoke about 25 languages. He was once asked which were the most difficult he had to learn. He was raised speaking Japanese, and he said English and Vietnamese. And my question to you is, what biblical translations are there in Vietnamese, which is very much a phonetic language? The definitions change.
It's a tonal language. Yeah.
Based on the way what you're hearing.
I know there's a modern translation to Vietnamese. I can't read it, and I don't know how it has been esteemed. But let me just say one more thing about Navajo. You probably know that Navajo was one of the code talker languages during World War II. And Navajos are very proud of that, and they keep track as the last code talkers are dying now. That comes up all the time in Navajo news. I know people who have worked in Vietnam, and I know they've used a Vietnamese Bible. That's about all I could say. Barbara?
I was just going to tell a remembrance from travel, and this may have happened to other people in the group, but I can pull up in my mind so clearly Jerome in a cave in Israel where he was to translate the Bible. And it's just funny, the things you remember, I can picture it. Just, I don't know how many years ago, but it was so strong and wonderful memory.
Yeah, that's interesting. He started that work in Rome, but then he did take it with him and finish that Vulgate work in Bethlehem. Yeah.
That's where it was.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we're done. As I said, next week I'm going to try to just show some of the things that translators deal with and some of the questions that are hard to answer. So bring your own experiences of translation or reading translation and we can talk about it.